Hello and welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class podcast. I'm your host Hashim Moin, and today we will be talking about the first wave of the women's movement. The first wave of the women's movement occurred from 1910 to 1950. Beginning in 1900, women's attitudes towards themselves began to change. Before, the goal assigned to women in life was to marry, have children, run the house, and be a loyal wife to their husbands. Women had to give up any chance of education to do so. The women's movement was an attempt to reform on issues women had been facing for centuries. Women joined forces to achieve legal and political equality. Many of you may think why it took so long for people to start to fight for women's rights and why the first phase of feminism occurred from 1910 to 1950. There were many reasons, but the main ones were lack of organization supporting women's rights and the spark to get everything on track and moving. That spark proved to be World War I. The women's movement was not only in Canada but was spreading all around the world at this time. The women's movement was an event that had been building up for centuries now, and this was a perfect time. Let's look at some of the opening steps of the women's movement first phase. In 1910, Emily Murphy, who was an extremely active leader in the women's movement, convinced the Alberta legislature to pass the Married Women's Relief Act, which required the court to give a widow part of her husband's estate if he does not provide for her. Then in 1911, the Saskatchewan Deserted Wives Maintenance Act did the same. Attitudes towards women's rights began to change when World War I broke out. Their roles changed from mothers to workers. War was considered more important than anything else, and people were needed to fill the jobs. Since men were out fighting, the women were needed to work and fill in the spots left by men. Many people thought that women were not equal to men and could not do the jobs as well as men. The women proved those people wrong. Roles had also been increased for women. Women spent their time doing fundraisers and knitting socks and clothes for men. When World War I ended and the men returned, the gaps that were filled by women were given back to the men. Women wanted to keep their jobs and started to fight for their rights to be able to work like men. When the war was over, women had gained respect and proved that they could also work like men. Although many women lost their job when men returned, their contributions to the war changed attitudes toward women for the better. The first wave of the women's movement was focused for the most part on women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement was many decades-long struggle for the right of women to vote in political elections and run for the office. At the beginning of the 20th century, women in many countries had begun to organize themselves to gain the right to vote. Members of this movement were called suffragists. In 1917, during World War I, Prime Minister Robert Borden was unpopular among Canadians. He had also previously brought in conscription, and in fear of losing the election, he introduced the Wartime Elections Act. This gave female relatives of soldiers the right to vote. Canadian nurses serving overseas could also vote. Manitoba became the first province to finally give women the right to vote in 1916. That was followed by Saskatchewan, Alberta, and then British Columbia that same year. Women won the right to vote in Ontario in 1917, Nova Scotia in 1918, New Brunswick in 1919, Prince Edward Island in 1922, Newfoundland and Labrador in 1925, and lastly Quebec in 1940. Despite all this, Aboriginal women and many other members of minority groups were not allowed to vote. In 1917, the Dower Act was passed in Alberta. The Dower Act was a provincial legislation that prevented a married person from selling or giving away the homestead without the approval of the other spouse. This also included the right to a life estate for the remainder of the spouse's life. The Dower Act was passed as a result of Emily Murphy. While Murphy was accompanying her husband on a trip, she met a woman who used to work on the farm with her husband. She had been left homeless after her husband sold their farm and left without her and her children. Murphy was horrified by this, as there was no legal action taken for the woman who had spent 18 years working on the family farm. Murphy then set out on a mission to help the woman and many others like her who had suffered the same fate. Murphy won the case, and in 1917, the Dower Act was finally passed in Alberta legislature, establishing a wife's right to one-third of her husband's estate and not being able to sell the property without the consent of the other spouse. This improved the life for Albertan women, as they now had more secure lives, even if their spouse were to leave them. The 1920s were also a great time for the women. There was a group well known as the Famous Five who successfully reshaped the position of women in the Canadian society. The Famous Five were five prominent women activists from Alberta who had gained an international reputation among reformers. Alberta's Famous Five were petitioners in the Persons case. Led by Judge Emily Murphy, the group included Henrietta Moore Edwards, Nellie McClung, Louis McKenney, and Irene Parlby. The Persons case was a case that was taken to Supreme Court in 1928, and it established the right of women to be appointed into the Senate. In 1928, the Supreme Court of Canada stated that women were not persons according to the BNA Act and hence were ineligible to be appointed to the Senate. However, the following year in 1929, the famous five appealed to the Privy Council of England, which reversed the decision. For the first time in history, women had the chance to be appointed to the Senate. Each individual member of the famous five went on to win many other rights for women too. Nellie McClung campaigned on legal protection for widows, better factory conditions, and a minimum wage for working. Henrietta Moore Edwards of the famous five published the first magazine for Canadian women. She named it Working Woman of Canada. This helped to bring working conditions into the public's eyes. Louise McKenney is recognized for being the first woman to be elected to a Canadian legislature when she won a seat on the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in 1917. This was the first election in which women could vote or run for the office in Alberta. Irene Parlby came from a rural background and hence her journey was dedicated to improving lives of those women. Lastly, Emily Murphy became the first female magistrate in the whole British Empire. A magistrate is a civil officer who manages the law. Overall, the famous five have put in a lot of effort in shaping the women's movement and have significantly contributed into getting women their rightful place in society today. These women were so influential that an organization called the Famous Five Foundation was named after them in 1996. Some of the other achievements of the 1920s included more working opportunities for women, and women also received the right to divorce and got equal parental rights. In the 1930s, women were given rights and chances that they had never been given before. In 1930, Karen Wilson became the first female senator. This was the first time in history that a woman had been given so much power in Canada. The amount of women receiving an education also increased in the 1930s. About 35% of the graduating students from university were female. This was a significant increase from the 1920s, which was an average of 16%. The time of World War II was very similar to World War I for women. When men left to fight in the war overseas, women were needed to fill in the jobs and help support the war effort. Women did the job effectively again and gained more respect from society. They once again proved that they are equal to men. However, this time women could keep their jobs because after World War II there was an economic boom which allowed women and men to work together. Throughout the course of the women's movement, there were many victories that women were proud of, but the most significant victory that was achieved was the right to vote. Women had been fighting over this for more than 72 years, and they vote today only because of the women's suffrage movement. Until the women had won the right to vote, they had no influence over anything. This was not just the greatest and most significant victory of the first phase of feminism, but one of the greatest victories for humanity of all time. The suffrage movement was a courageous and persistent political campaign involving thousands of women and men who put in countless effort to make the world a better place for women. Before the suffrage movement started, women were not even legally considered as people under the BNA Act. But look at the world around you now, and most of it is due to the suffrage movement. Overall, both of the phases of feminism made impactful changes on the lives of Canadian women today. But the phase that made the most impactful change was the first phase. The first phase of the women's movement saw women gain extremely important rights that built the foundation of the second phase of feminism. The right to work and the right to get paid equally as men, no domestic violence against women, parental rights, educational rights, support for the wife if the husband leaves the wife, and much, much more. But above all these, the right to be appointed to Senate and the right to vote were won from this phase, which are considered the greatest victories for women ever. This phase has been so influential and impactful in shaping the lives of today's Canadian women that it is without a doubt the greatest wave in the history of the women's movement. That's it for today. Tune in next time as we cover another great topic on the Stuff You Missed in History Class podcast.